Hi guys, welcome to JC Jog Support. This is an A-level video for paper 3 for Edexcel. So I'm going to go through some top tips for paper 3. I'm going to hold this up so you can maybe pause it if you can get a bit of shine off it. And I'll post this on Instagram as well, so you've kind of got it. So paper 3 is quite a long paper. It's over 2 hours. I think it's 2 hours 15. I can never remember exactly. And I'm just going to go over some top tips to make sure that you remember, because a lot of paper 3 is technique. So first of all, number one, make sure that you read the whole of the resource booklet. It's really important that you read it before you look at the questions, because you'll get an idea what elements of your compulsory components in paper 1 and 2 it's going to be about. Now remember, it's going to be only the compulsory components, so make sure you're re-looking at superpowers and globalization for your human. And for your physical, it can be tectonics or carbon and water. Now, I've got an idea that it might be on carbon this year, and it might be on renewables, and maybe how globalization or superpower status can be maintained by as resources are running out. It may not be, but I've just got an inkling. It hasn't really been on that before, so I think it might be. So, number one, read through your resource booklet. Number two, make sure that you annotate the booklet. This is your booklet, so you can annotate it, you can highlight it. Each resource has been given to you for a reason, not just because it looks pretty or not just because it's got some information in. It's got some information in it that you will need to use in your answers. So look at it and think to yourself, what is that resource getting at? What's the main purpose of that resource? And write it at the side of the resource. It's your paper, so do what you want with it. Okay, so do that, make sure you've done that. Next, I would say make sure that you read through the question paper, so you kind of get an idea of where the topic is going, and it should start kind of ringing bells for bits and pieces of other elements of the course, other elements of case studies that you've done. And as you're reading through the questions or even the resource, start writing down other things that you're remembering, other case studies, other things that link to the resource or the question, because in some of the questions you will have to use other parts of the compulsory elements in your answers. Maybe not necessarily case studies per se, but definitely ideas, maybe theories, maybe things that you know from the other bits of the course that are the compulsory elements. Next, number 4, I would always say highlight the command words and then annotate it a little bit so you know that you've answered the question correctly. So if it says describe, only describe. If it says explain, make sure you've explained using reasons. And if it says analyze, which we'll get to in a minute, make sure you're not just describing the data. So I would do that as well. I'd highlight each of the command words. The next one is analyze. There are 2 8-mark analyze questions. Now, analyze simply means describe and explain similarities and differences between the 2 resources. It will point you towards 2 resources for each of these analyze questions. You go to them and there will be links between them. There'll be either similarities or differences, there'll be anomalies, there'll be some kind of thing like that between the 2 pieces of resource. So again, jot down some ideas between these 2. There's no massive right or wrong answer, but you've got to come up with some things. And the description will be the use of the data, the use of the resource in your answer, and the explanation will be from your other knowledge of, let's say it's tectonics, it might be like linking strength of an earthquake with density of population. So you might have to talk about analyze the 2 pieces of data. So you're going to say things like, well, the areas where there's the strongest earthquake zones are the areas of highest population density. Okay, and then kind of be saying, well, that's around the coastline, because people obviously want to live around the coastline, but unfortunately this puts people at more risk. Maybe link it to Park's model or Dregg's model or something like that. So think about other elements of the explanation from the knowledge that you know. But you'll be looking for similarities and differences probably between those 2. So that is what analyze means. All right, just means describe and explain. Don't get like all upset by it or thinking I don't really know what to write. That's all it's asking for. And again, as long as you're coming up with valid reasons, there's no hard and fast answers to this. There's certain things that the examiner's looking for, but then the examiners always say in the mark scheme, accept anything that's reasonable. So as long as you're coming up with reasons for similarities or differences, then you'll get the marks. But make sure you use the resource. Now, the next one is your evaluate questions. So these are 2 questions at the end which is for 18 marks and 24 marks. Now, really, you should see these as kind of like a 14 marker and a kind of 20 marker, really, because they use data. So there's AO1, 2 and 3 that you can get here. So AO1 is obviously your knowledge, AO2 is your evaluate, and AO3 is the use of data. So don't think that it's a massive 24 marker. Just see it as a longer, it's a 20 marker, but you're going to use the data instead of from being your own head, it's from the resource. So they're not as kind of like intimidating as you think they are. They are longer than a 12 marker, obviously, so you must strike more than a side. But, you know, I would say for the 18 marker, 3 to 4 points. And I'd say for the 20 marker, 4 points and then maybe a little extra point. But if you've just used 4 points and you've explained them correctly and you've explained them in detail and you've used resource and a little bit of what you know anyway, then you're going to get the marks for that. So remember that evaluate means weigh up and come to a conclusion. So the important point for evaluate is that you have to think about which point, you know, the advantage or the disadvantage or the social, economic or environmental points that you're making, which one is the most relevant, which has the biggest impact. And I would always do a little bit of a plan here, because you could start your essay with, in my opinion, the most important point, or the factor that has the biggest impact, or the greatest advantage, or the reason why this should happen or not happen is this, and this is why, and then use your BLT to explain it. Then your next paragraph will be the next point, not as important as the previous one, but still having an impact. And then your other paragraph will say an additional point, which could be seen as important, although not as important as the first point. So I know it sounds like you're repeating yourself, but you have to really like signpost to the examiner that you've evaluated. You must have ongoing evaluation, okay, because they are evaluate questions. And then in your final paragraph, that will be your overall conclusion. So you will say, in my opinion, the most important point or the most important factor or the factor that has the biggest impact on whatever it is that they've asked you to do is this. And then you have got ongoing evaluation and you've got a conclusion. Now, I would always say that each factor or each point that you're making, put it in a separate paragraph. And in that way, you've really signposted the examiner that you've thought about several possibilities and several points. And it's not an English exam, it's a geography exam. So it doesn't matter that you've paragraphed each particular point. It will really make it very clear to the examiner each point that you've made. And then remember, that point needs to have an evaluation. So you need to, either at the beginning or the end, say this is the most important point because, or at the end, this point is important because, okay, so you need to really signpost. It doesn't matter whether you do it at the beginning or the end of each point. You've just got to signpost to the examiner that you have evaluated each point and you've given the significance of why you've thought that that particular factor or that particular point is more or less important than the previous one. You must use the data and the resource. It will often, well, the last one, the 24 markers say it says there, use the whole booklet. So because you've annotated the booklet, you should by that point be able to think, oh, I'll go to resource 3 or I'll go to resource 4 or I'll use your resource 7 or I'll use the views in resource 8 in your answer. And then if you can, but don't get too caught up with doing this, obviously you've got to think about what other information, what other stuff do you know from each of those units that you can bring in? What is it similar to? Okay, so do you know that you can link it to China and maybe like China's impact in Africa? Or do you know that you can link it to resources at the North Pole? Or do you know that you can link it to something about carbon or something about a water management strategy in the Colorado or something like that? So what other case study have you done? What other information do you know that you can say this is similar to, this is not similar to? And also think about maybe what theories you know, what bit of background information. So can you use Degg's model? Can you use the Clark-Fisher model? Can you use Mackinder's power theory? You know, what can you use that will exemplify what you want to say? So have a think about that as you're writing your answer. Again, if you kind of like think about that halfway through, don't be afraid to kind of put an asterisk somewhere in like your third point and then think, oh, this links to Mackinder's theory, because Mackinder was saying that the axis of power was Russia, but we've seen that it's lost that power, and now we know that power is moving west, from the west to the east, because we've got a power shift, or whatever it is. Don't be afraid to kind of doing that if it suddenly like pops into your head. It doesn't matter if it's not pretty. It doesn't matter if your essay is not pretty. It just matters that you've covered all the points. So they are my top tips for paper 3. But I think the most important point is read the resources and spend 10 to 15 minutes on the resources, making sure that you know where that the questions are going. And remember, it's only your compulsory elements, so don't bother looking at diverse places when you're revising over the weekend. Don't bother reading about coasts, because it's not going to be on it. Okay, so good luck, and I'll see you soon.